Hello, and welcome to my talk on how people make causal judgments about unprecedented societal events. Consider the common everyday scenario. Your hand accidentally knocks into a glass of milk and the milk spills out. Most people would agree with the statement that your hand caused the milk to spill. According to counterfactual theories of causal judgment, this is because people simulate the counterfactual that had you not knocked your hand into the glass of milk, it would not have spilled. In other words, your hand made a difference and was therefore the cause. Now, for this particular example, people have no problem generating this counterfactual world, given their rich experience with physical objects. But what about unprecedented events, in which people lack the prior experience needed to generate the counterfactual? How do people judge, for example, whether the delayed lockdown in the US was a cause of high COVID cases, when they have limited experience with what tends to work and not work in pandemics? In the present study, we tested the hypothesis that people look to structurally similar examples to generate the counterfactual. Other countries that share similar properties, such as culture and economy, for example. This tweet by political scientist Ian Bremmer demonstrates this idea. He is interested in explaining the causes of the high COVID cases in the US and chooses to compare this outcome with the European Union, a region with similar culture and economy, but at that time, different social policies. What is implied is that the EU's outcomes are what would have happened had the US enacted those same policies. Because there is a clear difference in outcomes, he confidently makes the causal judgment that Europe is managing the crisis with their policies, and that the lack of response in the US is what caused higher cases. What's also notable are the examples he did not include, such as countries in Asia that are relatively less similar to the US with respect to culture and economy. In other words, our hypothesis was not only that people look to structurally similar examples, but that they will privilege them over less similar examples. To test our hypothesis, we presented adults with an unprecedented societal event that was conceptually similar to the pandemic, a novel insect infestation which took place in the town of Hillsbrook, Pennsylvania. We said that scientists found out right away that the insect's bite was highly poisonous and told people to evacuate immediately. However, the evacuation was delayed by 5 days. Participants were then randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions, which varied in what data was presented. In the baseline condition, participants only got bite rate data on the target town of Hillsbrook. Similar to the COVID graphs shown in the media, the x-axis is time since the start of infestation, and on the y-axis is the outcome, in this case, percent of the population bitten. The trajectory shows the bite rate increasing from day 0 to day 5, which is when the evacuation occurred. After day 5, we made the trajectory ambiguous as to whether the evacuation had a causal effect. The trajectory flattens slightly, but does continue to rise. In the second condition, the structurally similar causal condition, we added data on 4 other towns that also had the infestation, but did not have delays in evacuations. Thus, these 4 other towns' data are possible counterfactuals of what would have happened had Hillsbrook immediately evacuated. The blue and green data are from structurally similar examples, other towns that are also in the state of Pennsylvania and thus similar with respect to population demographics and geographical region. Their low bite rates suggest that having an immediate evacuation would have made a difference. The orange and red data are from less similar examples, towns in developing Southeast Asian countries, which are less similar to Hillsbrook with respect to population demographics and region. These towns' high bite rates suggest the opposite causal conclusion, that having an immediate evacuation would not have made a difference. Because the 2 sets of examples supported opposite causal judgments, we could test whether participants privileged one set over the other in their judgments. Finally, we had a structurally similar not causal condition in which we simply swapped the labels of the other towns' data. Now, the less similar towns suggest the immediate evacuation made a difference, but the structurally similar examples indicate no effect. Here is a simplified schematic of the three conditions altogether. As a reminder, in the baseline condition, there are no other examples for the participant to reference. In the structurally similar causal condition, the other Pennsylvanian towns, circled in black, suggested that the immediate evacuation made a difference, while in the structurally similar not causal condition, those Pennsylvanian towns suggest that the early evacuation did not make a difference. After participants saw the respective data, they were asked to make a causal judgment. Did the delayed evacuation cause the high rates of Hillsbrook residents being bitten on a 0 to 100 scale? In addition, we asked participants to explain their causal judgments with the open-ended question, why do you think that? And this allowed us to code which information participants explicitly referenced when justifying their judgments. If participants look to structurally similar examples, as we hypothesized, they may withhold causal judgment at baseline since there are no other examples to reference, but then make strong causal judgments when the structurally similar examples suggest that the evacuation made a difference, but weak causal judgments when those structurally similar examples suggest that the immediate evacuation did not make a difference. There are also other possible results that we considered. Rather than look to structurally similar examples, participants may privilege their prior causal knowledge that, in general, moving away from insects prevents being bitten. If so, we'd expect participants to make strong causal judgments about Hillsbrook's delayed evacuation across conditions and override the additional data that counters this prior knowledge. Finally, we also considered the possibility that participants may vary significantly, with some participants privileging prior knowledge and others paying attention to Pennsylvania and others paying attention to Asia. If so, we might expect scores to average to around 50 across conditions. I'll now show you people's causal judgments by condition, which is on the x-axis with the respective schema. Starting with the structurally similar causal condition in which the Pennsylvanian towns, but not the Asian towns, indicated that the evacuation made a difference, people made strong causal judgments that were significantly higher than the midpoint. In contrast, people made weaker causal judgments in the structurally similar not causal condition, when the Pennsylvania data in particular suggested that the evacuation had no effect. Interestingly, people's strong causal judgments in the baseline condition suggest that people may generate their own counterfactual in the absence of other data rather than withhold causal judgment. Thus, so far, we see some support for our hypothesis that people adjust their causal judgments based on structurally similar examples, but we also see that people draw on their prior causal knowledge when they have no other data in the baseline condition. I'll next show you the explanation results to see what information people explicitly discussed. Recall that we asked participants, why do you think that? And we coded participants' explanations into the 5 following categories. First, there were explanations that only focused on the Pennsylvanian data, so the structurally similar examples. One participant in the structurally similar not causal condition said, the other 2 towns in Pennsylvania that evacuated had high bite rates, even though they evacuated without any delay. Next, there are a few participants who referenced both sets of examples. So here is an explanation of that type. Because in other cities of Pennsylvania, there were less residents bitten. However, in Indonesia and Malaysia, there was still a high increase in population being bitten even after being evacuated. There were participants who only referenced the Asian data. So the data for Kapang and Dima suggests that there are external factors that contribute to the population being bitten aside from evacuation time. And then there were participants who only referenced the causal mechanism, suggesting that they were relying on their own prior causal knowledge, such as saying, evacuation prevents people being bitten, and not referencing the other towns. The 5th, other category, captured the remaining idiosyncratic responses. So I'll now show individual participants' causal judgments color-coded by their explanation. For the baseline condition, you can see that the majority of participants are color-coded as orange, meaning that they discussed the causal mechanism. As expected, this was generally linked to strong causal judgments above the midpoint. In the structurally similar, not causal condition, the majority of participants, color-coded in dark green, mentioned the Pennsylvanian towns in their explanations, and this was, as expected, linked to weaker causal judgments. Interestingly, you can see that the other types of explanations were also logically linked to participants' causal judgment scores. Participants who privileged their prior causal knowledge in orange continued to show strong causal judgments, and so did participants who privileged the Asian data shown in blue, as this data also supported a strong causal judgment. Finally, here is the explanation data for the structurally similar causal condition. Now, while the average causal judgment suggested that participants may be privileging the Pennsylvanian data, the modal explanation was actually causal mechanism shown in orange rather than Pennsylvanian towns. What we think may be going on here is that when the structurally similar examples support people's prior causal knowledge, people may prefer to stick with simple and broad explanations for their judgments, such as saying things like evacuations prevent bug bites. Overall, the causal judgment and explanation data together indicate a more nuanced account for describing people's causal reasoning about unprecedented societal events. People privilege their prior causal knowledge when they lack additional data and when structurally similar examples support this prior causal knowledge. However, people will reliably privilege structurally similar examples when those examples provide counter evidence. So in this case, that actually an immediate evacuation would not have made a difference. And as I mentioned before, there's some interesting individual variability. So some participants privileged their prior causal knowledge, even when the Pennsylvania data suggested that the evacuation would have not made a difference. And this was linked to opposite causal conclusions as compared to participants who paid attention to the Pennsylvania data. We think that these findings raise some important questions. First, how might these inferential processes unfold in the real world, where there are many structurally similar examples to choose from that support different conclusions? This graph here shows that the US can be compared to several European countries, as well as Canada, which all vary in their outcomes. Second, future research could examine whether political motivations and media sources affect which examples people privilege. Perhaps people reference examples that support their desired conclusions. Consider Trump's discussion in the 2020 presidential debate of how the US was doing. He says, "You see the spikes in Europe and many other places right now. If you notice, the mortality rate is down in the US, 85%. The excess mortality rate is way down and much lower than almost any other country." You can see that he now uses Europe's outcomes when it benefits his political agenda. We think that future work should explore the extent to which differences in counterfactual simulations may be a source of political polarization on societal issues. Finally, we're interested in the extent to which our findings, which focused on societal events, may apply to any event in which people have limited prior knowledge. Might this pattern of results emerge when people reason about a novel physical object? We suspect that participants will still draw on prior knowledge about objects in general and privilege structurally similar examples if it counters their priors. But there may be important domain differences. In the domain of societal issues, people may be more likely to reject counter evidence when it violates deeply held beliefs. I look forward to further discussion about this work and future directions in the Q&A. With that, I want to acknowledge my collaborators, labs, and funders, and thank you for listening.